Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. So as the Vice President said, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to kind of answer the question that we've been asked a lot. In fact, we had a very productive teleconference with the Senate Democratic Caucus just a few hours ago, and they asked a number of questions which were really reasonable questions, questions that are on the mind of a lot of different people. And one of them was the question that was just posed a moment ago, is are there enough tests to allow us to be able to go through this first phase in a way that is protective of the health and the safety of the American people? So I just want to spend a couple of minutes clarifying a few things and maybe providing some information on a broad 40,000 foot, which you'll hear some of the more granular details from my colleagues who will be following me. I think they asked me to give the 40,000 foot one because I'm not a testing person. I didn't run a testing lab, but I'm part of a team that is looking at this, of how we can best make sure this happens in the right way. So first of all, let me say something that we said before, and I apologize if I'm repeating things that you already know, but I think in some respects it's important to do that so that people have clarity in what we're talking about. There are two general types of tests, even though within each general type there are different subgroups. One of them is to actually test for the infection. Is a person infected? The other, and I'll get back to that in a second, the other is to test, as was just mentioned, if someone has been infected. Usually someone has been infected who has recovered, and as I'll get to in a moment, that you could assume, although we need to do some more work on that, that that person is actually protected against subsequent exposure and infection with an identical organism. So what are some of the pluses and minuses of each? Because the pluses and minuses are really going to impact how we best use the test and how the test actually should be used. So let's take the test for whether or not you're infected. The test of whether or not you're infected is a test that right now is called a nucleic acid test. It's not an easy test to do. There are some that are more rapid. There are some that have a high throughput. There are different groups within that. The good news about that is that it's a sensitive and specific test, so that if you're infected, you know you're infected, so that, as I'll get to in a moment, if you need to do something with that, get that person, put them in care, take care of them, get them out of circulation. That's important. The part about that that I think is often misunderstood is that if you get a test today, like I did today, it's negative. If you get a test today, that does not mean that tomorrow or the next day or the next day or the next day, as you get exposed, perhaps from someone who may not even know they're infected, that means that I'm negative, which means if you take that to its extreme, in order to be really sure, you would almost have to test somebody either every day or every other day or every week or what it is to be absolutely certain. That's an issue. Now, the problem that I talk about when I try and compare this to other situations with what testing means to you. I, as I think most people know, have been involved in HIV/AIDS for 38 years, 39 years, from the very first week of HIV. So that's what I do. If you get a test for HIV and you are negative and you do not practice any risk behaviors, you can be guaranteed that next month, 6 months, 1 year from now, you will be negative if you don't have a risk behavior. So there's a big difference there about what testing actually means. So the point I think you're getting is that although there is clearly a place for needing to test somebody for a given reason, a test means you're negative now. Now, the other test is an antibody test, a test that tells you, in fact, that you've been infected. That's really good. You're going to hear a bit about that from my colleagues in a moment, because that will give you a broader view of two things. One, what the penetrance of the infection had been. And number two, you can make an assumption, though we still need to prove that. I mean, we are assuming that if you're infected and you have antibody, you're protected. And I think that's a reasonable assumption based on our experience with other viruses. But what we want to make sure that we know, and these are some of the challenges, what is the titer that is protective? How long is the protection? Is it 1 month? Is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? It's a year. So we need to be humble and modest that we don't know everything about it, but it really is an important test. The other thing is the difference between testing and monitoring out there, what's out there. The difference between what we really need it for phase 1 is to be able to identify, isolate, contact trace, a very important part of when you're pulling back gradually and slowly on the mitigation, and you have people who might be infected. You want to know they're infected. You want to put them in care. That is something that we absolutely need to do. But there are other ways. I want to make sure people understand that not to underestimate the importance of testing. Testing is a part, an important part, of a multifaceted way that we are going to control and ultimately end this outbreak. So please don't anyone interpret it that I'm downplaying testing. But the emphasis that we've been hearing is essentially testing is everything, and it isn't. It's the kinds of things that we've been doing, the mitigation strategies that are an important part of that. Now, just a couple of things before I hand it over to my colleagues. No doubt that early on we had a problem. I have publicly said that we had a problem early on. There was a problem that had to be corrected, and it was corrected. It was a problem that was a technical problem from within that was corrected, and it was an issue of embracing the way we have now and should have the private sector, who clearly has the capability of making and providing tests at the level that we will need them for any of the things that I've just spoken about. So, having said that, right now, I totally understand, and I'm not alone, my colleagues understand, that although we say there are X number of tests out there, and you're going to hear from Admiral Giroir about that, the fact is there have been and still are situations that are correctable and will be corrected, and some of which have been corrected. I know I get on the phone a lot with my colleagues because, believe it or not, some long time ago, I was where they are in the hospitals, in the emergency room, looking at very sick individuals that you need to take care of. And I know what it means when someone tells you, hey, you have what you need, and you look around and you say, well, maybe you think I have what I need, but I don't really have what I need. So we have to figure out, how do we close that gap? And there are a lot of things that I think we've learned and that we are correcting and going to correct. Namely, you have a situation where tests are needed and appropriate, and either people have found there's no tests, or there's no reagents, or there's no swabs, or a person needed a test and were told that there was a restriction. They couldn't get a test. These are all the things that I'm telling you, you already know because you've heard them. So right now, or there's a delay of 5 to 7 days. And what does that mean if you want to get somebody out of circulation? We understand that that existed, but upon careful examination, what you are going to hear, that many of those have been already corrected and other of those will be corrected. Because what I think people don't appreciate through no fault of their own is that there are two issues. There's supply and demand. And if you have a supply that can meet the demand, but the supply is not connected to demand, then supply-demand falls apart. What do I mean by that? I mean, there is existing capacity that we have that for one reason or other maybe has not been fully communicated as to the availability of that existing capacity, and you're going to hear about that now. There's production capacity that gets better and better and better. And that's what we're talking about, because for what we need now, we believe that with better communications, we'll be able to make that happen. So I know there's going to be a lot of questions about that. I don't want to go on too long, but let me just finish by saying, given what I've just said and what I believe what you're going to hear, that for what we need in the first phase, if these things are done correctly, what I believe they can, we will have and there will be enough tests to allow us to take this country safely through phase one. Thank you.